No, it's fine, it's only been 3 months since I covered MKX, not 8.
That's a first.
You say that to everything. Now, this is where things start to get complicated. Yes, Injustice 1 had me counting both personas and counterparts for 2 different tallies per category, and this game doesn't do multiverse stuff, but it did introduce chapters where you choose who to play as, requiring a decision to be made on how to address those. I had this whole bit planned where I'd, smugly, put off having to decide until MK11 because the Injustice 2 mobile game lets you play the story mode and gives you set characters for those fights, allowing us to take NetherRealm's word on which fights are canonical. But it only covers the first 8 chapters and ends with, I'm not kidding, Harley getting impaled by Diana, not even the rest of the cutscene, just that point, so chapters 10 and 11 will have to be figured out by me. A lot of the fights have more detailed interactions and cinematography with specific fighters, suggesting that's the intended matchup. And where I can't find a clear conclusion, I'll default to the mobile version's approach of splitting them evenly between the two, so the specific matchups aren't always that important. I'll explain my rationale for each towards the end. You may disagree on some of my conclusions, but you're factually wrong because a content creator's opinion is automatically worth more, I've learned. Also, fun fact, certain cutscenes were re-rendered for this version, changing the looks of certain characters. Wonder Woman has that combat skirt thing instead of the blue leggings. Bruce and Clark have their new armors during chapter 1, despite the reveal shots of the armors remaining in the later scenes. Harley's hallucination outfit is now only loosely inspired by the classic, and Joker wears black instead of purple. Poison Ivy has a crown and a more detailed outfit. Rod's armor is a much brighter gold, and there's an assortment of smaller tweaks elsewhere. I'm guessing the designs this version uses were chosen first and they had to accommodate it with the cutscenes, which is incredibly backwards. Anyway, let's get to it. Batman defeats Cyborg, defeats Wonder Woman, defeats Superman, defeats Damian, defeats Firestorm, loses to Brainiac in a cutscene, defeats Brainiac in gameplay, defeats Aquaman, defeats Black Adam, defeats Wonder Woman, and defeats Superman. That's 10-1. I think we can guess who's going to win then. Damian Wayne loses to Batman, loses to Firestorm, and loses to Supergirl. That's 0-3. The Joker Vision loses to Harley. That's 0-1. Catwoman loses to Black Canary, defeats Harley Quinn, and defeats Bane. That's 2-1. Harley Quinn defeats Poison Ivy, defeats Scarecrow, defeats the Joker Vision, defeats Swamp Thing, loses to Gorilla Grodd off screen, and loses to Catwoman. That's 4-2. Poison Ivy loses to Harley, defeats Cyborg off screen, and loses to Cyborg in gameplay. That's 1-2. Scarecrow loses to Harley, and loses to Wonder Woman. That's 0-2. Bane defeats Green Arrow off screen, loses to Green Arrow in gameplay, loses to Green Lantern, and loses to Catwoman. That's 1-3. Deadshot loses to the Flash, and loses to Cyborg off screen. That's 0-2. Superman loses to Batman, loses to Supergirl, defeats Swamp Thing in a cutscene, defeats Swamp Thing in gameplay, defeats Dr. Fate, defeats Brainiac, defeats Green Lantern, defeats the Flash, defeats Supergirl, and loses to Batman. That's 7-3. Supergirl loses to Firestorm, loses to Cheetah off screen, defeats Wonder Woman, defeats Damian, defeats Black Adam, defeats Superman, loses to Black Adam in a cutscene, and loses to Superman. That's 4-4. Brainiac defeats Batman in a cutscene, loses to Superman, and loses to Batman in gameplay. That's 1-2. Wonder Woman loses to Batman, loses to Blue Beetle off screen, defeats Captain Cold, defeats Reverse Flash, defeats Scarecrow, defeats Cheetah, loses to Supergirl, loses to Flash in a cutscene, and loses to Batman. That's 4-5. Cheetah loses to Green Lantern, defeats Supergirl off screen, and loses to Wonder Woman. That's 1-2. The Flash defeats Captain Cold, defeats Deadshot, defeats Reverse Flash, defeats Green Lantern, defeats Wonder Woman in a cutscene, and loses to Superman. That's 5-1. Reverse Flash loses to the Flash, and loses to Wonder Woman. That's 0-2. Gorilla Grodd defeats Harley off screen, loses to Green Arrow, and loses to Black Adam. That's 1-2. Captain Cold loses to the Flash, and loses to Wonder Woman. That's 0-2. Green Lantern loses to the Flash, defeats Aquaman, defeats Cheetah, defeats Bane, defeats Atrocitus, and loses to Superman. That's 4-2. Atrocitus loses to Green Lantern, and fucks off forever. That's 0-1. Aquaman loses to Green Lantern, defeats Black Canary, defeats Green Arrow, and loses to Batman. That's 2-2. Green Arrow loses to Bane off screen, defeats Bane on screen, defeats Gorilla Grodd, and loses to Aquaman. That's 2-2. Black Canary defeats Catwoman, defeats Dr. Fate, and loses to Aquaman. That's 2-1. Cyborg loses to Batman, loses to Blue Beetle, loses to Poison Ivy off screen, defeats Poison Ivy in gameplay, defeats Deadshot off screen, and defeats Grid. That's 3 to 3. Grid loses to Cyborg. That's 0 to 1. Blue Beetle defeats Black Adam, defeats Cyborg, defeats Wonder Woman off screen, and loses to Black Adam. That's 3 to 1. Firestorm defeats Damian, defeats Supergirl, and loses to Batman. That's 2 to 1. Dr. Fate loses to Black Canary, and loses to Superman. That's 0 to 2. Swamp Thing loses to Harley Quinn, loses to Superman in a cutscene, and loses to Superman in gameplay. That's 0 to 3. Black Adam loses to Blue Beetle, loses to Supergirl, defeats Blue Beetle, defeats Gorilla Grodd, defeats Supergirl in a cutscene, and loses to Batman. That's 3 to 3. Now, before we look over the results to find some fun conclusions, I'll explain why I chose the winners I did. Aquaman vs Black Canary. While the scene after the fight has more going on if you choose Adam, the character direction is weird in the scene before the fight. He uses lightning to force the other enemies away, and then Arthur runs past Adam and Dinah to fight them, instead of forcing them back himself like Adam does in his version, Aquaman vs Green Arrow. There is fight choreography in this version, and Adam has something to keep him occupied. The Adam version is lifeless by comparison, and the bombardment just stops. Black Adam vs Blue Beetle. While the Aquaman version gives insight into Grodd's greater plans, the shot of the weapon shifting in the Adam version is more interesting than Jaime just walking backwards. Plus, Aquaman's stance is inconsistent once we return to the definitive canon material when choosing him, but consistent with Adam. Black Adam vs Gorilla Grodd. Both for an even split, and because Adam and Grodd exchange barbs while Grodd says nothing to Arthur. Batman vs Firestorm. Partly because I felt Superman was more fitting for the next two fights, and partly because, while Clark's comment towards Firestorm is a neat callback and adds some dimension, Bruce going in with a Batarang to make Firestorm less of a threat, coupled with this being a member of Bruce's new team, really makes it feel like Bruce should take the lead here. Plus, Bruce being the one to lay Swamp Thing out before the proper fight is less believable in a game without the power pills being mentioned. Superman vs Swamp Thing. There's a bit more unique cinematography and stage direction here, and in terms of power scaling, Superman makes more sense fighting the Guardian of the Green while Batman fights the bots. Superman vs Dr. Fate. Batman has nothing to say to Kent, but Clark does, and it addresses lore from the comic as well. Batman vs Superman. Superman's victory is explicitly presented as a bad outcome that would be a poor choice to end the series on, and was covered in the He-Man crossover comic. While that arguably makes this ending more canon since it actually has a follow-up, the inconsistent continuity in the comic, coupled with my belief that it was chosen because they assumed a third game would follow the Batman ending, I'm inclined to assume Batman wins unless a third game is announced that declares otherwise. And now for a nice and easy discussion of the results. The fighter with the most fight is Batman with 11. The fighters with the least fight are Atrocitus, Grid, and the Joker with 1 each. Atrocitus and Grid obviously win this one because Joker isn't real. The most overdone matchup is Batman vs Superman with the Canon 2, and a third variant if you play every fight in the game, placing it above any other repeat fights. The fighter with the most wins is Batman with 10. The fighters with the least wins are Atrocitus, Captain Cold, Damian Wayne, Deadshot, Dr. Fate, Grid, the Joker, Reverse Flash, Scarecrow, and Swamp Thing with 0 each. The fighter with the most losses is, shock of all shocks, Wonder Woman with 5. The fighters with the least losses are Atrocitus, Batman, Black Canary, Blue Beetle, Catwoman, Firestorm, The Flash, Grid, and the Joker with 1 each. The strongest ratio is, obviously, Batman's 10 to 1. The most balanced ratios are 2 to 2 shared by Aquaman and Green Arrow, 3 to 3 shared by Black Adam and Cyborg, and Supergirl's 4 to 4. The weakest ratio is 0 to 3, held by Damian Wayne and Swamp Thing. And now we make things complicated again, since our comparisons to last time also need to acknowledge the Persona results and the version results. Fuck. The biggest Persona glow-up is Harley Quinn, who went 0 to 2 between them last time, but Regime Harley alone brought in 4 wins, albeit with the same number of losses. The biggest character glow-up is Green Lantern, who went from a pitiful 0 to 4 that weighed his prime self down in the Persona Awards, up to a respectable 4 to 2. But shout out to Batman, who managed to, exactly, double his wins and halve his losses from last time. The most static Persona is Bane, who achieves 1 to 3 in both games. The closest we have to a most static character is Green Arrow, whose prime counterpart got an even 4 to 4, and Earth 3 Ollie got an equally even 2 to 2, but that's as close as it gets. There is no actual most static character this time. The biggest Persona downgrade is the Joker, going from a nice 4 to 2 down to 0 to 1. But since he's a figment of Harley's imagination, we'll say Cyborg takes the spot, coming away with 2 less wins and an extra loss over last time. The biggest character downgrade is Damian Wayne, going from 1 win and 2 losses to 0 wins and 3 losses, and he calls himself the son of the Bat. So our final conclusion is that Batman is the winner of Injustice 2, having the most wins by a full 3 over Superman, tying for least losses at 1, getting a huge glow up from last time, and just generally having the most fights with a canon 10, but a total range of 9 to 12 just for him. Really, his only failing here is producing our biggest loser, Damian Wayne, who not only has 0 wins, but has the biggest fall off, impressive for a non-playable character in the previous game, and he's only spared the dishonour of sharing most losses because Wonder Woman is in this video game, and video games as a rule fucking despise this woman. The next episode is going to really complicate matters by not only having the selectable fighters thing again, but also having 2 versions of most of its cast, and actually I lied, it's 4 of the buggers if we count Aftermath as a separate timeline, which it is. Maybe I'll hold on to those extra 5 months I earned while I figure this nonsense out. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? You get early access to new videos for just $1 a month. If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is Injustice 2 Mobile, Story Mode, Gameplay Walkthrough Part 9, All Chapters, iOS Android, by Tap Gameplay, whose mobile footage I sourced for both research and the opening segment.